She remembered the older woman's hands pressing clay over stone, both palms flat, working in slow overlapping strokes until the seam disappeared. Cool air leaked from below. The pit mouth smelled of dried sweetgrass and packed earth, and something deeper, something patient. The woman had taken her small hand and pushed it against the seal. Feel, she said. The air below does not move. What you give to the earth holds. She was 7 then. Now she was 32, standing on a Kansas claim with 2 children, no husband, no mule team, and a swarm eating its way east toward everything she had left. The morning Pater left, he did not say goodbye to the children. Marit found the note on the table beside a tin cup still warm from his hands. His writing was bad. It had always been bad, but the words were clear enough. He had signed against the sorghum with Hargrove's Mercantile. $14 drawn on a crop that was still standing in the field. The mule team was gone. The second wagon was gone. He had taken the good harness and the spare axle and left everything that could not pull its own weight, including her. What remained fit in a list short enough to make a person sick. 1 unfinished barn of green cottonwood planks, 1 hand cart with a split rail, 2 hogs too lean for autumn, 12 hens, a partial harvest of wheat and sorghum still standing unthreshed in the field, and $23 in mixed coin and store credit, most of it already spoken for. She had no draft animal, no second laborer, no kin within 400 miles. And the claim, if she abandoned it, reverted with every improvement she and Peter had put into the ground over 2 years of breaking sod, hauling water, and sleeping on a dirt floor until the planks came. She could not leave. That was the fact beneath every other fact. A woman alone with 2 children, no team, no passage money, and a forfeiture clause that would erase everything. She was fixed to this quarter section of Hodgeman County as surely as the fence posts were fixed in their holes. Anders stood barefoot in the alkali dust of the yard, holding a broken harness trace, as if someone might come back and take the other end. Lena sat on the step and asked when Papa was bringing the mules home. Reports had already started moving through the settlement like a slow fever. Fields west of them, stripped to stubble overnight. A neighbor's brother-in-law rode through 2 days prior, saying the hoppers were eating fence rails in Edwards County. Not just grain, wood, leather, cloth, anything that held salt from a human hand. The swarm was moving east, and between it and Marit's unthreshed crop stood nothing but open prairie, and whatever she could manage with her own hands, and a 9-year-old boy who still looked down the road every evening, waiting for a wagon that was not coming back. Elias Bender arrived on the 4th day after Pater's disappearance. He rode a dun mare with a blaze face and carried his authority the way he carried everything, without asking permission. 58 years old, built like a fence post left out too long, Bender served as the township's unofficial advisor on the strength of having survived more bad years than anyone else still breathing in the county. He had buried 2 wives on the plains and rebuilt after a prairie fire that took his first barn, his winter stores, and all of his hair above the left ear. People listened to him because he was still alive, which on the frontier was the only credential that held weight. He hitched the mare to the fence post Pater had never finished setting and walked the property without greeting Marit or the children. He started at the barn. The north seam gaped where green planks had already begun to shrink in the summer heat. Daylight showed through in 3 places, bright slits that striped the packed earth floor like knife cuts. The roof had been framed but not sealed at the ridge, and the last rain had pooled against the west eave joint and left a dark stain that still smelled of wet wood and iron nails bleeding rust. Bender pressed his thumb against the north wall. The plank gave slightly. He ran his hand down the seam and hooked a finger into the gap, then pulled it out and wiped his hand on his trousers as if the barn had gotten something on him. "You have half a barn," he said. He did not look at her. He looked at the structure the way a doctor looks at a limb that will not heal. "The north wall will open another inch before September. Your roof leaks at the ridge seam, and again at the eave joint on the west side. which means any rain pools against the base of whatever you store inside. Even if you had proper lumber to close these gaps, and you do not, green cottonwood shrinks. It will keep shrinking until December, and by then the gaps are wide enough for a child's hand. Boards are just invitations. Marit stood with her arms folded against her chest, not because she wanted to argue, because she already knew everything he was saying and needed him to finish saying it so she could think past it. He walked to the sorghum field. The stalks stood in uneven rows. Peter had never planted straight, and the heads were beginning to turn but were not yet ready for clean threshing. Bender pulled ahead, rolled the grain between his thick fingers, and frowned at it the way he frowned at everything that fell short of adequate. "How much do you figure you have standing?" he asked. "Wheat and sorghum together, maybe enough for bread flour through March if I thresh clean. Seed stock for spring planting. A little feed grain beyond that if the hens keep laying and I do not have to trade eggs for anything else." "And where are you putting it?" She pointed at the barn. Bender exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath that carried the weight of every failed homestead he had watched go under. "A family of 3, a woman and 2 children, needs protected grain for bread, porridge, and seed through a full winter. That means tight storage, Mrs. Tveit. Sealed against damp, sealed against vermin, sealed against anything that crawls, flies, or chews." He turned and gestured at the barn with his full arm as if presenting evidence to a jury that had already made up its mind. "What you have there would not keep rats out for a week. The gaps are open. The floor's dirt. There's no interior bin, no sealed container, nothing between your grain and whatever wants it except planks that are already pulling apart at the seams. I know the barn is not enough." "The barn is not anything," Bender said. His voice was flat, not angry, flat, which was worse. "You do not have the lumber for a tight granary. You do not have the nails or the hardware for sealed bins. You do not have a second pair of hands to build either one, and you do not have the time. If the hoppers come, and every man west of here says they are coming, those boards might as well be a dinner table with a sign on it." He paused, looked at her for the first time, not her farm, not her barn, but her. His eyes were the color of old creek water, and they held nothing soft in them, but nothing mean either. Just the blunt assessment of a man who believed honesty and kindness were the same act. "The practical course," he said, "is to thresh what you can right now, sell it to Hargrove at whatever price he will give, use the money to buy passage, and get yourself and your children to Wichita before the worst of it arrives. You have people there?" "No." "Family anywhere?" "Norway. My mother's sister in Decorah, Iowa. She wrote last at Christmas. I do not know if she is still there." "Then Wichita. There is church work. There are laundries. You could—" "I owe Hargrove already," Marit said. Pater signed the sorghum advance, all of it. Bender's mouth opened and then closed. He looked at the field, at the barn, at the children on the step, and back at her. The arithmetic was rewriting itself behind his eyes, and the new sum was worse than the old one. "All of it," he repeated. $14 against the sorghum. If I sell to him, I am paying my own debt with my own crop. I come out with nothing." The silence that followed was the loudest thing on the claim. A meadowlark called from the fence line, and the sound was so clean and thoughtless that it felt like an insult. "Then I do not know what to tell you," Bender said. He untied the mare, swung up with the economy of a man who had been getting on horses for 50 years. "I will ask around about day labor. Someone might have threshing work that pays in kind, but I would not count on it, and I would not wait." He rode out without looking back. The dust from the mare's hooves hung in the air and then settled over the yard like a verdict. Anders watched the horse until the heat shimmer swallowed it. Then he looked at his mother. He did not ask the question. He did not need to. It sat in his face like a stone pressing against glass, visible, silent, and sharp enough to cut if it ever broke through. She did not know what to tell him either. Not yet. 2 days later, Marit walked the dry draw south of the claim, looking for clay to patch the barn roof. A useless barn was still better than no barn if she could slow the water, and she needed dense, packable soil, the kind that shed rain when it dried. She found it in a collapsed bank where spring runoff had cut a vertical face into the hillside. The exposed clay was pale gray, tight-grained, and cool to the touch even in the full heat of afternoon. She pressed her palm flat against the cut face and held it there. The soil did not crumble. It did not shift. And it was cold. Not cool the way shade is cool, but cold the way the inside of the earth is cold, the way deep ground stays cold because the sun can never reach it, no matter how long it tries. She stood with her hand on the bank, and the memory arrived without invitation. She was 7 years old. Upper Missouri, late autumn, at the homestead of her grandmother's cousin, a woman whose mother had been Hidatsa and whose hands moved over earth the way other women's hands moved over fabric. The woman knelt at the mouth of a narrow pit cut into a clay bank behind the house. The pit was not wide. A grown woman could barely fit her shoulders through the opening, but below, the chamber widened into a bell shape, and inside that cool darkness sat clay pots and hide bundles of seed grain, dried corn, and strips of dried squash sealed with grass plugs and sweetgrass wrapping. The woman pressed damp clay over a flat stone cap with both palms, working it in overlapping strokes until the seam between stone and earth disappeared. Then she took the girl's small hand and pressed it against the seal. "Feel," she said. "The air below does not move. It does not heat. What you give to the earth holds. Nothing from above can reach what is below." Marit had felt it, the cold, still air leaking through the clay, the smell of dried sweetgrass and packed soil, and something older than any person alive. She had filed the moment the way children file things they do not yet understand, tucked it away in the place where knowledge waits until the world asks for it. Now the world was asking. She stood at the collapsed bank in Hodgman County, Kansas, with her palm flat against clay that felt the same, cold, still, dense enough to hold a shape. And the memory reassembled itself from a childhood curiosity into a design. A narrow mouth, small enough that one person could cap it with a single stone or plank. A wider chamber below, bell-shaped, dug into clay dense enough to support its own walls. Straw lining at the base and sides to keep grain from sitting directly against damp earth. A stone or plank cap sealed with wet clay, packed and smoothed until the seam disappeared. The earth would do what cottonwood boards could not. No insect could chew through 4 feet of packed clay. No wind could carry grain scent out of a sealed hole. The grain would sit in cool darkness while the world above was stripped to stubble and splinters. The logic held. The risk was enormous. If she spent her days digging a pit and the pit failed, if the walls collapsed, if moisture seeped and ruined the grain, if the seal cracked, she would have lost the time she needed for any conventional salvage. She would have buried her family's food in a hole that became a grave for it. The grain would rot underground while her children went hungry above. But if she did nothing different, she would almost certainly lose everything anyway. Bender had said it. The barn could not protect grain from a swarm that ate wood. She did not have the lumber or the nails or the hands for anything better above ground. The arithmetic was the same every time she ran it, and every time it came up short. She cut a fist-sized piece of clay from the bank with her knife, carried it home, wetted it, pressed it over the mouth of an empty crock, and set the crock in shade beside an identical uncovered crock, a handful of wheat kernels in each. Then she waited. Marta Schilling came by the next afternoon. She farmed the claims south with her husband and 4 children, and she was not a cruel woman. She was a practical one, which on the frontier amounted to the same thing as often as it did not. She found Marit kneeling beside the 2 crocks, prying the clay seal off the covered one. The uncovered crock had a fine layer of dust on the grain and two small beetles moving through the kernels. The covered crock held grain that was clean, cool, and dry. No dust, no insects, no change. "What are you testing?" Marta asked. Marit held up the clean grain. "Underground storage, a sealed pit dug into clay. The earth keeps the air still and cold. Nothing gets in." Marta's face arranged itself into the expression of a woman who cares about her neighbor, but cannot endorse what the neighbor is doing. "Underground means damp," she said. "Everyone who has tried a root cellar on this soil knows it. You put grain in a hole in the ground. You get moisture wicking up through the earth. Moisture means mold. Mold means you lose the whole store at once instead of losing it a handful at a time to vermin. At least with the barn you can see what is happening. You can move grain, spread it to dry, pick out the bad kernels. Underground, you seal it and pray. And when you open it in January, you find black slime where your seed stock used to be. Not if the clay is dense enough to act as a barrier. Not if the lining is dry straw. Not if the mouth is sealed so tight that no air moves in or out." "You tested one crock for one night," Marta said. She picked up a kernel and rubbed it between her fingers, testing for any surface moisture. "This is not a winter. This is not your whole supply sitting in damp soil for 4 months while you cannot check it. What happens if the cap cracks? What happens if water finds a channel you did not see? You open the pit in December, and your family's survival is a barrel of rot." "And if I put it in the barn," Marit said, "I will not have until December. I will not have 3 hours once the swarm comes through." The silence between them was the silence of two women who understood the same arithmetic and could not make it balance. Marta set the kernel down. Her jaw worked slightly, the small motion of someone swallowing an argument they know they have already lost. "I hope you're right," Marta said. "I do not believe you are, but I hope it." She left without offering help. Marit did not expect any. She sealed a second crock and buried it 6 inches deep in the clay bank, capping it with a grass plug and a layer of packed earth. She would check it in 3 days. If the grain came out clean, she would start digging. The mockery started before the first spadeful of earth came out of the ground. Silas Hargrove heard about the pit from someone. Marit never learned who. Hargrove ran the mercantile 8 miles east and held Pater's paper, which meant he held Marit's future in a ledger book bound in leather that smelled of tobacco and old debt. He was not a large man. He was a thin man with clean hands and a voice that stayed level no matter what it was saying, which made everything he said sound like a final ruling. He made his money on dependency, selling seed and flour on credit to families who would pay him back in grain at prices he set, and when the grain came up short, he bought their claims and tools at fractions. A woman who found a way to store her own grain and outlast a crisis was a woman who did not need Silas Hargrove, and Silas Hargrove understood that arithmetic better than anyone in the county. He came to the fence line on a Tuesday morning. Marit was scoring the outline of the pit mouth with a mattock, marking the circle that would become the throat of the chamber. The ground was drought-hardened and rang under the blade like crockery. Each stroke sent a jolt up through her forearms into her shoulders. Anders was hauling straw from the barn in armloads, stacking it where his mother pointed. Hargrove leaned on the fence and watched. He did not speak. He let the watching do its work, the slow, appraising gaze of a man calculating what he saw against what was owed. "Mrs. Tveit," he said, "your husband signed for $14 against this fall's sorghum. That paper comes due at harvest. I expect you are aware." "I know what Peter signed. I have been patient. I am a patient man. Ask anyone. But patience has a ledger too. And what I see right now is a woman who owes me $14 digging a hole in the ground instead of threshing her crop." The crop will be threshed. The pit is where it goes after. Hargrove tilted his head. The gesture was small and sharp, like a bird that has spotted something moving in the grass. A pit, he said, underground storage. Sealed with clay. The grain stays cool and dry and nothing can reach it. Nothing can reach it. He let the words hang, then shook his head once. Not the shake of a man who disagrees, but the shake of a man who has heard something so far beneath consideration that disagreement would dignify it. You are burying food like a badger because you cannot build a proper granary, and you are doing it on my time, with grain that is pledged to my store. The grain is pledged at harvest. It is not harvest yet. When that hole fills with rot, Hargrove said, and his voice did not rise, but it narrowed, the way a blade narrows toward its edge. Do not come to me for flour. You owe me more than you have already, and I do not extend credit to people who bury their assets in the dirt. He straightened from the fence. I will be back for what is owed. Mrs. Tveit. One way or another. He walked to his wagon. The wheels creaked over hard ground, and the sound faded slowly, the way a threat fades, not all at once, but in stages, each stage a reminder that it will come back. Anders stood holding an armload of straw and watching the dust settle. Then he turned to his mother. Is he right? About the money, yes. We owe him. About the pit. Marit drove the mattock into the clay line. The impact shook up through her wrists, and her blistered palms screamed against the handle. No, she said. He is not right about the pit. Anders looked at the scored circle in the dirt. He looked at the half-finished barn. He looked down the road where Hargrove's wagon was becoming a dark point against the shimmering grass. Then he set down the straw and picked up the smaller spade without being told. If you have ever been told your idea was foolish by someone who stood to gain from your failure, tell us about it in the comments. CEO. By the end of the first week, the settlement had made its judgment. Marit was the woman digging a grave for corn. At the mercantile, two men she had never spoken to stood by the counter and discussed her as plainly as they would discuss a lame horse. She's out there swinging a mattock in this heat with a child hauling straw, one said. Petter was not much, but at least he knew what a granary looked like. A woman at the church gathering told Marta Schilling that she ought to stop visiting the Tveit claim before the foolishness became contagious. Children from neighboring claims came to the fence to stare. They did not mock Marit directly. They were too young for open cruelty and too old for complete innocence. But they watched with the wide-eyed attention of children who have been told something is wrong and want to see for themselves. Anders heard one of them say his mother was building a house for worms. He did not respond. He carried another armload of straw to the pit mouth and did not look up. The isolation cut deeper than the words. On the frontier, survival depended on a web of small exchanges that no one tracked in a ledger, but everyone depended on. A cup of rendered lard returned with a little extra, a spare axe handle left on the fence post, a neighbor's wife watching the children for an afternoon while you worked the field. These small acts held the settlement together the way mortar holds bricks. And when they stopped, the structure weakened. The exchanges stopped for Marit, not with announcements, with absences. The things that did not arrive told her more clearly than any spoken verdict what the settlement had decided about her chances. She kept digging. Her hands blistered on the second day, bled through the wrappings on the third, and by the fourth had developed the thick, cracked calluses of someone who would not stop regardless of what the skin wanted. She tore strips from a flour sack, wrapped her palms, and drove the mattock into the earth again. The pit mouth was 2 feet across, narrow enough that a single stone slab or plank section could cap it. Below, she had begun to widen the chamber, cutting at an angle so the bell shape would hold. The clay was dense and cooperative. It came out in clean slabs that kept their edges, which meant the walls would keep their shape. She stacked the spoil beside the hole, and it grew into a mound that looked, from the road, like a fresh grave, a comparison she was sure Hargrove had already made. 3 feet down, the temperature changed. The air at the bottom of the shaft was noticeably cooler than the surface, even at midday, even when the sun hammered the yard hard enough to crack mud. That was the principle. That was the thing Bender and Hargrove and the men at the mercantile could not see from above ground. The earth was a seal that nothing alive could chew through, and below 4 feet it stayed cold enough to slow every process that turned good grain into rot. But 3 feet was not enough. She needed 5 feet of depth before the bell could begin. She needed the chamber wide enough to hold bread flour, seed stock, and feed for 3 people through a Kansas winter. She needed straw lining, a cap, and a clay seal. And the reports kept coming. A rider passed through on the 5th day. The swarm had crossed into Ness County, 30 miles west, moving east. The man said the sound carried ahead of the cloud, a dry clicking that built into a roar so thick you could not hear a person shouting beside you. He said the fields looked like they had been shaved by a razor the size of a county. He said a family near Ransom had watched their laundry eaten off the line, 30 miles. At the rate the swarm traveled, she had perhaps 10 days, maybe 12 if the wind shifted, though the wind had not shifted in a month and showed no inclination to start. She was 3 feet into a hole that needed to be 5 feet deep and 4 feet wide at the bell. She had no help except a 9-year-old boy, no draft animal, and palms that left blood on the mattock handle every time she picked it up. On the 6th morning, she heard a sound she did not expect. A man's voice, low and unhurried, coming from the direction of the dry draw. She climbed out of the pit with the mattock in her hand and saw a figure walking the bank where she had first found the clay, a tall man, older, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone reading the ground the way other people read printed pages. Thomas White Crane was 64 years old, mixed heritage, a mother from the Kaw Nation, and a father who had been a surveyor for the Army before drink and disappointment reduced him to odd work in rail camps. White Crane had lived on the plains his whole life. He had worked as an interpreter, a scout, a farmer, and a hauler of other people's freight. He had seen more storage methods fail than most people had seen built, and he had also seen the ones that lasted, the ones that went down instead of up, the ones that worked with the earth instead of against it. He stopped at the edge of the pit and looked down. He did not speak. He studied the walls, the angle of the cut, the narrowness of the mouth, the quality of the clay she had been pulling. Then he looked at her hands, the wrappings, the bloodstains, the way she held the mattock with her fingers curled to keep the blisters off the wood. "You chose the right clay," he said, "and you got the neck right, narrow. Most people make the mouth too wide and then they cannot seal it." Marit said nothing. She waited. "How deep are you?" 3 feet. I need 5 before I widen." White Crane crouched at the pit edge and ran his hand along the inside wall. He knocked his knuckles against the clay and listened to the sound, a dull, dense thud, not the hollow ring of soil that would collapse under pressure. He nodded once to himself, the way a man nods when he has confirmed something he suspected. "You will not get 5 feet in 10 days alone," he said. "Not widening, not lining, not with one mattock and a boy." "I know." "I am not here to do your work for you," White Crane said. He straightened. His knees cracked. "But I have seen pits like this hold grain for years, and I have seen people dig them wrong and lose everything. The difference is in the details, and you have some of them right and some of them wrong." "Which ones are wrong?" He pointed at the south wall of the shaft, where she had been cutting straight down. "You're following the surface angle. Down here the clay has a seam. You can see it if you look, where the density changes. If you widen the bell past that seam, the wall will slough when it gets wet. And it will get wet. It always gets wet eventually. Marit looked where he pointed. She could see it, a faint line in the clay face where the color shifted from gray to a slightly warmer brown. She had not noticed it. She had been digging too fast, too desperate, too focused on depth to read what the earth was telling her. Well, stay inside the gray, White Crane said. The gray holds. The brown will betray you. He came back the next morning with a short-handled spade that had been reground so many times the blade was half its original width. He did not explain why he was helping. He did not make a speech about duty or charity or recognizing something in her. He simply began working on the opposite side of the chamber, cutting the bell angle along the seam line he had shown her, and for the first time since Peter left, the sound in the yard was two tools striking clay instead of one. The pit deepened. 4 feet, 4.5. The temperature dropped with every inch, the air at the bottom now cold enough that Marit's sweat dried on her arms the moment she stopped swinging. Anders hauled spoil in a bucket and dumped it behind the barn where the mound would not be visible from the road. Lena sat in the doorway and watched the hole grow and did not cry about it anymore, which was either progress or exhaustion. 5 feet. The bell began. And 30 miles west, moving east across stripped fields and chewed fence posts and empty laundry lines, the sky was filling with wings. White Crane did not talk while he worked. He listened. He listened to the mattock striking clay. And when the sound changed, when the dense thud thinned into something with a slight ring behind it, he stopped Merritt's arm mid-swing. Hear that? He said. The clay is thinning on this side, sandy layer underneath. If you cut past it, you open a channel for water. He tapped the wall with his knuckle. The sound was different from the opposite side, lighter, less solid, like the difference between knocking on a door and knocking on a wall. Leave this section alone. Widen the other direction where the gray runs deep. It was the second teaching, and it came through the same method as the first. Not explanation, but correction. White Crane did not lecture. He waited until the work itself produced the question, and then he answered it with his hands. He showed Marit how to read the soil by fracture, how dense clay broke in clean slabs with sharp edges, while weaker clay crumbled and left a grainy residue on the fingers. He showed her how to test the walls by pressing the flat of her palm against them and pushing. Good clay pushed back. Bad clay gave, just slightly, just enough to warn you that it would keep giving when water arrived. The bell widened, 5 feet deep, 3 feet across, then 3.5. The chamber was taking shape, a bottle buried in the earth with its mouth pointed at the sky. Marit could stand inside it now with her arms extended and not touch the walls, which meant the grain would have room to breathe. White Crane said, breathing was wrong. The grain should not breathe at all. Breathing meant air exchange. Air exchange meant moisture, insects, heat. The whole point was stillness. A pit is not a cellar, he said, crouching at the mouth and handing down a bundle of dried grass. A cellar has a door. A door opens. A pit has a seal. A seal does not open until you break it. That is the difference between storing and hiding. The lining went in next. Dried grass, not fresh, which would rot and introduce moisture, layered against the floor and walls so that no grain would sit directly against earth. White Crane showed Marit how to bundle the grass tight and wedge it into the curved walls so it would not shift when grain pressed against it. Anders carried grass from the draw in armloads, tripping over the long stalks, dropping half of each load and going back for more. He did not complain. He had stopped complaining 3 days after his father left. and the silence that replaced the complaints was worse than any words could have been. On the 8th day of digging, a setback. The south wall of the bell chamber sloughed. A section of clay the size of a grain sack detached from the curved surface and slid to the floor, leaving a raw, wet hollow where the gray clay had given way to the brown layer White Crane had warned about. Marit was inside the pit when it happened. The sound was soft, a sigh of earth letting go, and then the weight of the slab landed on her foot and pinned it to the floor. White Crane pulled her out. Her ankle was not broken, but it swelled to twice its size by evening, and she could not bear weight on it without her vision going white at the edges. She sat on the step with her foot propped on a bucket of creek water and stared at the pit mouth and calculated what the lost day would cost her. "The wall needs to be packed back," White Crane said. He was already mixing clay and water in a bucket, working it into a thick paste with his hands. "We cut into the brown. I should have checked the seam deeper before we widened. We did not have time to check. We did not have time not to." He carried the paste down into the pit and began pressing it into the hollow where the wall had failed, building it back in layers the way a mason builds a wall, each layer tamped flat before the next went on. It would take a day to dry, a day they did not have. The reports that evening said the swarm had moved again, Pawnee County now, 20 miles west. A family that had tried to save their field by lighting fires along the perimeter watched the grasshoppers fly through the smoke and land on the crop behind it. Fire did not stop them. Blankets did not stop them. A man in Garfield County had fired a shotgun into the cloud, and the pellets disappeared into the mass without visible effect. Nothing above ground stopped them. 20 miles, maybe 7 days. Merritt's ankle kept her off the mattock for 2 days. She spent them threshing. She could sit on a stool and beat grain heads against a board, and the work was slow and punishing on her shoulders and back, but it produced clean grain that needed a place to go. The small sack pile growing beside the step was both progress and pressure. Every pound of threshed grain that sat above ground in the open air was a pound that the swarm could take. Anders worked the pit alone on those days, deepening the floor and smoothing the repaired wall under White Crane's direction. When Marit asked how the boy was managing, White Crane said, "He listens better than you do. He has not tried to cut past the seam once." On the 3rd day, her ankle held enough to stand. She went back into the pit. White Crane's 3rd teaching came that afternoon, and it was the most important. He brought a flat stone, sandstone, roughly 2 feet across, chipped to a rough circle and laid it over the pit mouth. Then he showed Marit how to seal it. "The seal is everything," he said. "You can dig the best pit in the territory and lose it all to a bad seal. The mouth is where the world gets in." He mixed clay and water to a consistency thicker than mortar, but thinner than bread dough. Then he pressed it over the stone cap in overlapping strokes, filling every gap between stone and earth, smoothing it with both palms until the seam disappeared. He worked the way the Hidatsa woman in Marit's memory had worked, not fast, not slow, but with the even pressure of someone who understood that the seal was not a task to finish, but a surface to perfect. "When it dries," he said, "it becomes part of the ground. You cannot see where the cap ends and the yard begins. That is what you want. A pit that does not look like a pit. A store that does not look like a store." "Why does it matter if it is hidden?" White Crane looked at her. His eyes were dark and still and held something behind them that was not sadness, but was related to sadness the way a scar is related to the wound that made it. "Because people who are starving do not ask permission," he said, "and a thing that cannot be seen cannot be taken." He also taught concealment, the spoil heap, the mound of clay that had been growing beside the pit, had to be moved, dragged behind the barn, spread flat, covered with dust and dead grass until it matched the yard. The pit mouth, once sealed, should sit beneath a layer of ordinary dirt. No mark, no mound, no advertisement. A visitor should be able to walk across it without knowing what was beneath their feet. Marit understood. She also understood that White Crane was not only talking about grasshoppers. The days blurred into a rhythm of clay and sweat and the sound of tools striking earth. Each morning Marit checked the sky to the west, and each morning the sky was empty, which meant one more day. Each evening she counted what had been done and what remained, and the difference between the two numbers was always larger than the hours in front of her. Progress, measured. The bell chamber was wide enough now to hold the family's grain, bread flour, seed stock, feed, packed in sacks and nested against the straw-lined walls. The floor was level and dry. The walls had been tested. White Crane knocked on them every morning like a man checking a horse's legs, and they held. The capstone sat ready beside the mouth. The ceiling clay was mixed and covered with wet cloth to keep it workable. What remained? Threshing. The grain was still half in the field and half on the threshing board beside the step. Every hour Marit spent in the pit was an hour she did not spend converting standing crop into storable grain, and the crop could not go underground while it was still on the stalk. She split her days, mornings in the pit finishing the lining, afternoons beating grain heads until her shoulders seized and her palms cracked open again through the calluses. Anders threshed alongside her. His hands were too small for the flail, so he used a section of plank, slamming grain heads against it with a motion that was half labor and half anger. He did not talk about his father anymore. He talked about the pit, how deep it was, how cold the air felt at the bottom, how the walls rang when you knocked on them. He had made the pit his, the way children make things their own by knowing the details adults overlook. He knew which section of the wall had been repaired. He knew where the gray clay was deepest. He knew the exact number of straw bundles lining the floor. They argued once, Marit and White Crane. She wanted to widen the bell chamber another 6 inches to fit an extra sack of seed stock. He said no. The gray clay ran deep enough on the north side, and she could see the space. And 6 inches was nothing against a wall that had already proven it could hold. 6 inches past the safe line is how pits collapse, White Crane said. He was standing at the mouth, looking down at her with his arms folded. I have seen a man lose a season store because he wanted one more bushel. The clay looked fine. It held for 2 months. Then it rained, and the extra 6 inches let the water in, and the whole south face came down on top of the grain. This is not the south face. This is the north side, and the clay is solid. The clay is solid until it is not. You cannot see water channels in clay. You can only see what they do after they find a weak point. His voice was steady, not angry, patient in the way that patience becomes its own kind of pressure. Your job is not to fit one more sack. Your job is to make sure the sacks that are already in there survive until spring. She wanted to argue. She stood in the belly of the pit with the mattock raised, and the north wall smooth and dense under her free hand, and every instinct told her there was room. But White Crane had been right about the south wall. He had been right about the seam. He had been right about every detail she had been too desperate to notice. She lowered the mattock. Fine, she said. No wider. No wider, he agreed. And that was the end of it. Lena had been coughing for 2 days. A dry, tight cough that came from deep in her chest and rattled when she breathed at night. Marit boiled water with dried sage and made the girl breathe the steam, but the cough did not loosen. On the plains, a child's cough in summer usually cleared on its own. Usually. The word sat in Marit's chest like a stone she could not swallow. She lost a day to Lena. Not a full day. She threshed in the afternoon while the child slept. But a day's worth of pit work, a day's worth of lining and testing and moving grain underground. The arithmetic recalculated itself without mercy. 15 miles west now, 5 days, maybe 6. The pit was ready. The grain was not. Elias Bender came back. He rode the same dun mare and wore the same expression of practiced concern that was indistinguishable from disapproval. He looked at the pit, or rather, he looked at where the pit was not, because White Crane had already concealed the mouth under a layer of yard dirt, and Bender walked within 3 feet of it without noticing. "I see you have been busy," Bender said, looking at the threshing set up in the sack pile. "Where are you storing?" "Underground." His face did something complicated. "You went ahead with it." "I went ahead with it." He dismounted and stood in the yard and looked at the ground as if trying to find the thing she had buried. He could not. That, at least, gave Marit a small satisfaction she tried not to show. "Even if the grain survives the ground," Bender said, "what happens after a rain? Water pools on flat ground. It finds the cap. It seeps through. You wake up one morning and your winter supply is soup. The cap is stone sealed with clay. The clay is packed in layers. Water runs over it the way water runs over bedrock. Bedrock does not crack when it dries. I will wet the seal before it dries completely, and again, before any hard rain." Bender shook his head, not with contempt, with the weary frustration of a man who has given advice that was not taken and now must watch the consequences arrive. "I hope you know what you are doing, Mrs. Tveit, because what is coming will not care whether your idea was clever." "I know what is coming," Marit said. "That is why I am doing this." He left. The mare's hooves raised dust that drifted east toward the settlement, toward the families who were doing what families had always done, stacking grain in barns, nailing blankets over gaps, trusting wood and cloth, and the hope that this year would not be as bad as the report said. That evening, an unexpected thing. Marta Schilling's eldest boy, a quiet 12-year-old named Rolf, appeared at the fence carrying 2 large bundles of dried straw bound with twine. He set them down without a word and turned to leave. "Rolf," Marit said, "your mother sent this?" The boy hesitated. Then he nodded once, quickly, as if the admission cost him something. "She said not to tell anyone." Marit carried the straw to the pit mouth after the boy left. She stood in the yard holding it and understood what it meant. Marta still did not believe the pit would work. But Marta had seen the grasshoppers beginning to strip kitchen gardens to the west, and doubt was no longer enough to override the fear. The straw was not belief. It was hedging. It was enough. The last sack of threshed grain went underground on a morning that smelled of heat and something else, a dry mineral sharpness that Marit had never smelled before, as if the air itself was being ground down by what was coming. White Crane helped her lower the sacks into the bell chamber, stacking them against the straw-lined walls in the order he specified: feed grain at the bottom, bread flour in the middle, seed stock at the top where it would come out last and stay protected longest. "Seed stock last," he said. "If you have to open early, you eat the feed and the flour. The seed is the future. You do not eat the future unless there is no other choice." They packed the sacks tight. The chamber was full, not overflowing, but full in the way a well-built thing is full, with every space accounted for and nothing wasted. Marit stood at the mouth and looked down into the dark belly of the pit and tried to feel confident. She felt sick instead. Everything her family needed to survive the winter was below her feet in a hole she had dug with her own bleeding hands, sealed with a method she had learned from a childhood memory and an old man's corrections. If she was wrong, her children would starve. White Crane laid the stone cap. Marit pressed the sealing clay over it, the motion she had practiced, overlapping strokes, both palms, smooth until the seam vanished. The clay was cool and heavy in her hands. It smelled like the deep earth it came from. She worked it the way she had been taught, and when she finished, the pit mouth was gone. The yard looked like yard. A visitor would see packed dirt and dry grass and nothing beneath it worth noticing. White Crane stood back and studied the surface. He walked across it. He scuffed his boot over the seal. He nodded. "It will hold," he said. "You are sure?" "I have seen this hold through floods and fire, and 20 years of weather. The earth does not forget how to keep things." He paused. "But the earth does not care about you either. If the seal fails, it fails. You watch it, you maintain it, you do not trust it blindly." Marit looked west. The horizon was empty, but the emptiness had a quality to it now, a waiting quality, a held breath. The air smelled of crushed ragweed and baked dust, and something she had no word for, the scent of a sky that was about to fill. The grasshoppers came on a Tuesday. The first sign was not the insects. It was the chickens. 12 hens, scratching in the yard as they always did, suddenly stopped moving at the same moment, as if someone had spoken a word only chickens understood. They stood motionless with their heads tilted, listening. Then every bird ran for the barn at once, a panicked rush of feathers and scrabbling feet, and the yard was empty. The second sign was the shadow. It did not move the way cloud shadow moves, rolling, gradual, crossing the grass in a slow wave. This shadow came from the west, and it came fast, a darkening that swallowed the horizon and kept coming. The light did not dim to gray. It dimmed to brown, a dirty, golden-brown haze that ate the sky from the bottom up, as if the earth were rising to meet the clouds. Then the sound. A dry ticking, faint at first, like gravel thrown against distant glass. It grew. It thickened. The ticking became a rustling, the rustling became a rasping, and the rasping became a roar that filled the air the way water fills a jar, not piece by piece, but all at once, total, with no room left for anything else. Marit could not hear her own voice. She shouted to Anders, who was standing at the barn door staring west, and her words vanished into the sound before they reached him. They hit the sorghum first, the stalks that were still standing, the ones Marit had not yet threshed, maybe a quarter of the original field, vanished. Not gradually. The heads disappeared in seconds. The stalks followed. Marit watched from the yard as a living curtain of insects swept across the remaining crop and left behind nothing but chewed stubs and bare earth. The field that had been green and heavy with grain 10 minutes ago was gray stubble. The hogs screamed. There was no other word for the sound. The two lean animals, penned behind the barn, screamed as grasshoppers landed on their ears, their snouts, their backs, crawling into every fold of skin. Anders ran for the pen. Marit ran after him. They draped wet sacking over the animals, and the grasshoppers chewed through the sacking. They tried canvas. The grasshoppers found the seams. The hogs kept screaming. White Crane appeared from the draw. He was carrying the last armload of dried grass, emergency lining material, and the insects were already crawling over his arms and shoulders. He moved through them the way a man moves through rain, not fighting it, just enduring. His face was set. His eyes were fixed on the pit location. "The seal," he said. "Check the seal." Marit ran. She dropped to her knees at the spot where the pit mouth was hidden and brushed away the covering dirt. The clay seal was intact. No cracks, no gaps. The insects were crawling over it, crawling over her hands, crawling up her arms, but they could not get through. The seal was earth, and they could not eat earth. She pressed her palms against the clay and felt its coolness and its stillness, and beneath her hands, the family's grain sat in silence while the world above was devoured. Lena was inside the house. Lena, who had been coughing for days, who had a fever that came and went like weather, was alone inside the house, and the grasshoppers were pushing under the door. Marit heard the child scream before she saw the insects spilling through the gap between the door and the threshold, a living stream of brown bodies forcing their way into every crack, every seam, every opening that was wider than a knife edge. They were inside the walls. She could hear them in the walls, a muffled rustling that sounded like the house itself was being consumed from within. Anders was already running. He reached the door before Marit and threw it open, and the insects poured out around him in a wave. Lena was on the bed, curled into a ball with a blanket pulled over her head, screaming through the fabric. Grasshoppers covered the blanket. They covered the floor. They had found the flour barrel, the small reserve Marit kept in the house for daily bread, and the surface of the flour was alive with feeding insects. Anders scooped Lena off the bed, blanket and all, and carried her outside. He was 9 years old, and she was 5, and he carried her the way a man carries a child he is afraid of dropping, stiff-armed and desperate. The grasshoppers fell off the blanket as he moved. Lena's screaming thinned into coughing, the deep, rattling cough that had been building for days, and the coughing did not stop. Marit's hands were full of decisions that all needed to be made in the same second. The house was breached. The flour barrel was lost. The hogs were still screaming. The last exposed sack of grain, a single sack she had held back for immediate use, not yet lowered into the pit, sat beside the threshing board, and the insects were 3 feet from it. "The sack!" she shouted at White Crane. But the roar of the swarm ate her voice. She pointed. White Crane saw the sack and moved for it. He grabbed it with both arms and ran for the pit location, hunched over the grain like a man shielding a child from a blow. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe because what happens next changes everything. Marit was already on her knees, scraping the covering dirt off the seal. Her fingers found the clay edge. She hesitated. Opening the pit meant breaking the seal. Breaking the seal meant the mouth would be exposed, even for seconds. And in those seconds, any insect that found the opening could enter the chamber where the winter's food was stored. One breach and everything she had built could be lost. White Crane reached her. He was breathing hard. Grasshoppers clung to his shirt, his hair, the sack in his arms. He looked at the seal, and he looked at her, and he understood the calculation she was making. "I will hold them off the mouth," he said. "You break the seal, I lower the sack, you reseal, fast. If any get inside, then we kill them inside, but they will not get inside if we are fast." Marit broke the seal. The clay cracked along the lines she had pressed, and the stone cap came free, and the pit mouth opened, a dark circle in the earth that smelled of cool grain and dried grass and stillness. White Crane shoved the sack through the opening, and it dropped into the chamber. Insects landed on the rim. Marit brushed them off with her forearm, grabbed the stone cap, and slammed it back into place. She pressed fresh clay from the bucket she kept beside the site and sealed it, not with the careful overlapping strokes White Crane had taught her, but with the desperate speed of a woman closing a door against a flood. The clay went on thick and uneven, but it went on. The seam vanished. The mouth disappeared. White Crane slapped 2 grasshoppers off the seal's surface before the clay set. Then he sat back on his heels and did not move for a long time. Around them, the settlement was being consumed. From where they knelt, Marit could hear sounds she would not forget. The rasping chew of a million mandibles working through wood, leather, and cloth. The crack of a barn door at the Gunderson place half a mile north giving way under the weight of insects massed against it. A woman's voice. She thought it was Marta, calling children in a tone that was not calling but commanding, the voice of someone who has stopped believing and started only surviving. The swarm stayed for 3 days. On the first day, the insects stripped everything green and most things that were not. They ate the remaining sorghum stubs down to the root crowns. They ate the bark off the fence posts, not just the loose outer bark, but the living cambium underneath, leaving pale, naked wood that looked obscene in the afternoon light. They ate the wooden handle of the mattock Marit had left in the yard, rasping away the sweat-soaked surface until the wood was raw and pale and wrong-looking, like bone stripped of flesh. They ate the rope that held the hog pen gate. They ate the leather hinges on the barn door. They ate the curtains through the window gaps. They ate the binding glue from the spine of the family Bible that sat on the shelf by the bed. That first evening, Marit walked to the fence line and looked toward the Gunderson place. She could hear what she could not see, a sound of splitting wood, a man's voice shouting, a child crying. The Gundersons had stacked their grain in a plank bin inside the barn and nailed the door shut with scrap lumber. The grasshoppers had found the seams within an hour. They had pushed through gaps no wider than a pencil lead and eaten the grain from the inside while the family tried to plug holes from the outside. By sundown, the barn floor was inches deep in frass and fouled grain, and the Gunderson children stood in the yard holding empty sacks and staring at the cloud overhead as if it were a personal enemy. On the second day, the sky was still brown. The sound was still total, a vibration that lived in the bones of the house, in the ground underfoot, in the teeth. Lena's cough had worsened. The child lay on the bed in the stripped house, breathing in shallow rasps that hitched at the top and rattled at the bottom, and Marit held a damp cloth over her mouth and nose to keep the insects out of her airways. She could feel the child's ribs moving under her hand like the slats of a broken fan. The flour barrel was empty, not eaten by a family, but scoured by mandibles until the wood itself was scored with feeding marks. The small jar of rendered lard was gone. The salt box had been gnawed through at the seam. The Davis family, a quarter-mile east, had tried the blanket method. Heavy wool blankets weighted with stones over their granary opening. The grasshoppers ate through the wool in the first 6 hours. By the second day, Mrs. Davis was pulling fouled grain from the bin, trying to winnow the insect waste from the kernels by hand. The grain she recovered was contaminated, gritty with frass, tainted with the sharp chemical smell the insects left on everything they touched. Edible, maybe. Enough for a winter, no. On the third day, the swarm thinned. The brown haze lifted in stages, first a lightening at the zenith, then the horizon reappearing, then sunlight returning, pale and wrong, falling on a landscape that looked like it had been burned without fire. The fields were stubble. The trees along the draw had been stripped of leaves and bark and stood skeletal against the sky as if winter had arrived in July. The yard was carpeted with dead and dying insects, a crackling layer of brown bodies that crunched underfoot with every step. The smell was indescribable, a sour, oily stench of crushed chitin and insect waste that would take weeks to fade from cloth and wood and hair. White Crane walked the perimeter. He checked the barn. The planks had been chewed at every gap, and the interior was dusted with insect waste and frass. He checked the neighbors' places from the fence line. The Gunderson barn was breached. He could see sacks that had been torn open, grain scattered and fouled on the floor. The Davis family, a quarter-mile east, had covered their granary with blankets and weighted them with stones. The blankets were eaten through. The stones sat on bare wood that was itself being consumed. Above ground, every stored crop in view was ruined or exposed. Below ground, the seal held. Marit knelt at the pit location and pressed her ear against the packed earth and heard nothing. No rustling, no feeding, no sound of any kind. Just the silence of 4 feet of clay doing what 4 feet of clay had always done, keeping the inside separate from the outside, the way the earth has kept things since before anyone was alive to watch it. But the relief was not clean, it was not simple, because Lena was sick, and the flour was gone, and the neighbors were standing in stripped yards looking at empty barns, and the question that had been driving the story, would the pit hold, had been answered, only to be replaced by a harder one. Marta Schilling's youngest boy, a child of 6 named Carl, collapsed on the 4th day. Exhaustion and hunger, the family's barn had been breached on the first afternoon, and their winter grain was fouled. The boy had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. He fell in the yard and did not get up, and Marta carried him inside and sat with him, and did not come out. Marit stood in her own yard, the pit beneath her feet sealed and sound, and looked toward the Schilling place. She had enough grain underground to feed her family through the winter. She also had a neighbor whose child was lying on a bed with his ribs showing through his shirt. The grain was hidden. It was safe. It was hers. She could keep the seal intact and let the settlement learn its own lessons. She could protect what she had built and what she had bled for and what every person in this county had told her was foolish. She had earned the right to say nothing and do nothing and survive alone. She thought about the woman at the pit mouth on the upper Missouri, pressing clay with both palms, sealing grain against a winter that had not yet arrived. She thought about White Crane's hands in the bucket, mixing clay for a seal on a pit that was not his. She thought about Marta's boy Rolf carrying straw to her fence in secret because his mother's doubt had not been strong enough to overcome her fear. The pit held everything her family needed. The question was whether her family was the only thing that needed it. She did not answer the question yet. The story had not reached that part. But the question was there, sitting on the sealed earth like a weight, and it would not move until she did. The swarm moved east. What it left behind was a county that looked like it had been scraped to the bone, bare fields, stripped trees, yards carpeted with dead insects that crunched and stank under every footstep. Within 2 days, the settlement was counting losses, and the count was bad. Marit opened the pit on the 5th morning after the swarm arrived. She did not do it alone. She waited until White Crane was present because he had built the seal and she wanted him to see whether it held, and because the act of breaking open the only food supply she had left was not something she could do without a witness. Anders stood beside the pit mouth. Lena sat on the step, wrapped in a blanket, coughing less than before, but still pale, still thin, still watching everything her mother did with the wide-eyed attention of a child who has learned that survival is not guaranteed. Marit scraped the covering dirt away. She found the clay seal intact, no cracks, no discoloration, no sign that anything had penetrated the surface. She broke the seal with the edge of a flat stone, working it carefully, lifting the cap out in one piece. Cold air rose from the pit mouth. It smelled of dried grass and clean grain and deep earth, and the smell was so different from the stench of dead insects and fouled barns that it felt like stepping from one world into another. She lowered herself into the chamber. The sacks sat where she had placed them, straw-lined walls on every side, the grain packed tight. She opened the top sack, seed stock. She poured a handful into her palm and held it to the light. The kernels were cool, dry, clean. No insect damage, no mold, no discoloration. She rubbed them between her fingers and they ran like water, smooth and sound, the way grain runs when nothing has touched it. White Crane looked down from the mouth and nodded. He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled at things working the way they were supposed to work, but the nod carried weight. Anders said, "It is all right?" "It is all right," Marit said. She said it twice because the first time her voice broke and the words did not carry. Elias Bender came the next day. He did not ride the dun mare this time. He walked, which told Marit something had changed. Bender never walked anywhere when he could ride, and the fact that he was on foot meant either the mare was sick or his pride was, and she suspected the latter. He stood in the yard and looked at the ground. He did not ask where the pit was. He knew by now that it existed, and the fact that Marit was not standing in her yard with the hollow, wrecked expression that every other farm wife in the county was wearing told him what he needed to know about whether it had worked. "Show me," he said. Marit led him to the pit. She scraped back the covering dirt and broke the seal, the second opening which she would need to reseal before nightfall. Bender got on his knees and looked down into the chamber. He did not speak for a long time. He looked at the straw lining, the packed clay walls, the sacks of grain sitting clean and dry in cool air, while every barn within 10 miles held nothing but fouled husks and insect waste. Then he sat back on his heels and rubbed his face with both hands. When his hands came down, his expression was not what Marit expected. It was not grudging. It was not stiff. It was tired. The tiredness of a man who has spent 58 years learning how things work and has just been shown that he missed something. "I told you boards were the only proper way," Bender said. His voice was quiet. "I told you to sell and leave. I walked this place and told you the arithmetic did not work." He looked at the grain. Earth kept what wood could not. "I was wrong about that. I have been wrong about other things in my life, but I have not been wrong about something this important in a long time." "You were not wrong about the barn," Marit said. "The barn failed exactly the way you said it would." "I was wrong about the answer." He stood, his knees cracked, and he winced. "I would like to understand how you built this. Not today. Today I need to figure out how to feed my own household through September. But when I come back, I want to understand the clay, the lining, the seal, all of it." "Come back whenever you like," Marit said. He walked away. At the fence he stopped and turned. "Mrs. Tavite, I apologize for telling you to leave." "You were trying to help." "I was trying to help with the wrong answer. That is worse than not helping at all." He left. His boots crunched on the dead insect carpet, and the sound followed him down the road until it was lost in the thin, damaged silence of a county trying to figure out what came next. Marta Schilling came 2 days later, and she did not come alone. She brought Carl, the 6-year-old who had collapsed. He was walking again, but his face was the color of old candle wax, and his eyes sat too deep in his skull. Marta carried a bucket with nothing in it, which was not unusual. People on the frontier carried empty containers as an unspoken signal that they were willing to receive. She stood at the fence and did not cross it. Marit came to meet her. "I heard you open the pit," Marta said. "I heard the grain was sound." "It was sound." Marta looked at Carl. The boy leaned against her hip and did not look up. "I told you underground meant mold," Marta said. "I told you the grain would rot. I told you one crock for one night was not a winter." She paused. Her jaw worked. "I was wrong. I would like to see how it works." Marit brought her to the pit. Marta knelt at the mouth the way Bender had knelt, and she looked at the chamber with the same long silence, and when she stood up her eyes were wet and she did not wipe them. "The straw," she said. "How thick does it need to be?" 2 inches at the base, 1 on the walls. White Crane can show you the bundling. "The clay. Does it have to be this kind? The soil on my claim is lighter. It has to be the dense gray. The brown clay does not hold. There's a bank in the draw south of here where the gray runs deep. You can cut from there. Marta looked at the grain sacks. How much did you save? Enough for bread and seed through winter. Maybe enough to share some if people need it. Marta's chin dropped. She pressed her lips together and breathed in through her nose, and the sound she made was not a word, but was close enough to one. Then she said, People need it. Carl has not had bread in 4 days. Marit pulled a sack from the pit. She measured out grain carefully, because careful was the only way to handle a supply that had to last, and poured it into Marta's empty bucket. Carl watched the grain fall, and his face changed. Not a smile. Something before a smile. Something more desperate and more fragile than a smile could hold. I will come back with questions about the digging, Marta said, and I will bring something. I do not know what yet, but I will bring something. Bring straw, Marit said. I will need more straw for the reseal. The settlement came, one household at a time. Not all at once, not with ceremony. They came the way the frontier teaches people to come, with an empty container and a question, and the willingness to stand at someone's fence and admit they had been wrong. A man named Gunderson, whose plank bin had been breached on the first day of the swarm, asked whether the method would work in sandier soil. Marit said no. He would need to dig where the clay was dense, which might mean digging farther from his house. He nodded and came back the next week with a shovel and questions about depth. A widow named Mrs. Albrecht, who had fed her children boiled grass soup for 3 days after the swarm, asked how much grain a pit could hold. Marit walked her through the arithmetic, chamber width, sack count, family size, months to spring. The numbers were specific because Marit had learned that specific numbers were the difference between a plan and a wish. Hargrove heard about the visitors. He did not come himself. He sent word through a man who owed him money, a quiet, debt-bent farmer named Tollef Haugen, who arrived at Marit's fence looking like he would rather be anywhere else. Mr. Hargrove says you are distributing grain that is pledged against his paper, Tollef said. He did not meet her eyes. The grain is mine. The paper was against the sorghum harvest, and the sorghum was eaten by grasshoppers. There is no harvest to collect against. Tollef blinked. He had not thought of that. He says he will be filing a claim. He can file what he likes. The grain in my pit was threshed and stored before the swarm. It is not sorghum. It is wheat and mixed feed from a harvest that was never pledged. Marit kept her voice level. She had learned that from White Crane, the power of a voice that does not rise. Tell Mr. Hargrove that if he wants to discuss the paper, he can come here himself. Tollef left. He looked relieved, which told Marit that whatever Hargrove had threatened him with to deliver the message was worse than the message itself. Hargrove did not come. Not yet. But the threat was there, circling the edges of the settlement like a dog waiting for someone to leave a door open. The weeks after the swarm were the time when Marit and White Crane's partnership deepened into something neither of them named. They worked together every day, not on Marit's pit, which was sealed and functioning, but on the land. White Crane helped her rebuild the hog pen with stripped branches lashed tight instead of nailed boards, because the nails were gone and the boards were chewed. He showed her how to repair the barn roof with layered sod instead of patching clay, which shed water better and lasted longer. She taught him the Norwegian method of binding grain sheaves so the heads stayed protected during transport, which he had never seen and which he adopted without comment or compliment, just a nod and a repetition of the technique that meant he had taken it in. They built a second practice pit together, smaller, shallower, meant as a demonstration for the families who would come asking. White Crane insisted on it. You cannot teach on the real thing, he said. The real thing has your food in it. A mistake on the real thing is a disaster. A mistake on the practice pit is is a lesson. They dug it in a half day. Working in a rhythm they had developed without discussing it, she cut the clay. He shaped the walls. She packed the lining. He fitted the cap. When they were finished, White Crane stood at the mouth and looked down and said, "This one is better than the first." "The first saved the grain." "The first saved the grain because you were lucky about the clay. This one would save the grain because you know why." He crouched and ran his hand along the bell wall. "Feel the difference. The angle here is steeper. That means less surface in contact with the earth. Less surface means less chance for moisture to migrate. You did that without thinking." She had done it without thinking. The knowledge had moved from her head into her hands without stopping to announce itself, and the fact that White Crane noticed was the closest thing to praise she would ever hear from him. They talked while they worked, not about feelings, about methods, about the places White Crane had been, the army supply depots where half the provisions rotted because quartermasters stored everything above ground in canvas tents and called it adequate. The Kaw settlements where his mother's people had kept seeds in clay-lined pits for generations before anyone with a survey chain arrived to tell them they were doing it wrong. The rail camps where a winter's worth of salt pork could be lost to a single warm week because the contractor had saved money on the storage shed. One evening, while they sat on the step and ate boiled grain with salt, the only meal Marit could afford to prepare twice a day, White Crane told her about his father, the surveyor who had been good at measuring land and bad at measuring himself, the man who could calculate a section line to within an inch, but could not calculate how many drinks turned a surveyor into a ditch digger. White Crane spoke about him the way you speak about weather that has passed, not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with the flat acceptance of someone who has already used up every feeling the subject can produce. "He taught me one thing worth keeping," White Crane said. "He said the earth does not lie. People lie. Maps lie. Contracts lie. But if you put a stake in the ground and measure from it, the number you get is the number that is there." He was right about that. He was wrong about almost everything else. Marit thought about Peter, about a man who had signed a note and left in the dark, and had not been right about anything except the distance between this claim and somewhere else. She did not say this. She did not need to. White Crane looked at her and looked away, and the silence between them held what words would have reduced. "Every failure I have seen," White Crane said one afternoon, crouching beside the barn and shaping a sod patch with his hands, "came from the same mistake. People build the way they learned to build, and when the threat does not match the building, they blame the threat. They never blame the method. Bender blamed the weather. Bender blames everything he did not plan for. That is not the same as blaming the method. He will learn. He is stubborn, but he is not stupid." There was a pause. White Crane's hands stopped moving. He was looking at the horizon, not the west, where the swarm had come from, but the north, where the sky was a different color in autumn, the gray-blue of distance and cold. "I have a sister's family north of here," he said, "near the Solomon River. I told them I would come before the snow." Marit said nothing. She waited. "I will stay through the first hard frost," he said, "to make sure the seal holds through a temperature change. After that, I need to go." "I know. You do not need me anymore. You know the clay. You know the lining. You know the seal. What you need now is what I cannot teach. You need to teach other people, and you cannot learn that from someone else doing it for you." The first hard frost came in late October. The ground stiffened. The pit seal contracted slightly. Marit checked it every morning, pressing her palms against the clay the way White Crane had taught her, and she added a thin layer of fresh clay to compensate. The grain inside stayed cold and still and dry. The method held. White Crane left on a morning when the sky was the color of iron and the grass had turned the pale gold of late autumn. He did not say goodbye in the way people say goodbye when they expect to come back. He said goodbye in the way people say goodbye when they are old and the road is long and they know what winter does to bodies that have already carried more than they were built for. He shook Anders's hand. The boy's grip was firm now, not a child's grip. White Crane held it for a moment longer than necessary, and then released it without comment, which was comment enough. He looked at Lena, who was standing in the doorway breathing clean October air with lungs that had finally cleared. He did not touch her. He nodded at her the way he nodded at work that was well done. Then he looked at Marit. "Remember what I told you about the seal," he said. "A pit has a seal. A seal does not open until you break it." "Not that." He paused. "The other thing, a store is only safe if you think like the danger. The danger changes. The store has to change with it." He walked north. Marit watched him until the grass swallowed his shape, and the horizon held nothing but empty sky and the suggestion of cold. She stood in the yard for a long time after he was gone. The air smelled of frost and dry grass and the faint, clean scent of turned earth. She had learned more from him in 6 weeks than she had learned from any person in her life, and the learning had come not through lectures or lessons, but through the simple act of working beside someone who paid attention to what the world was telling him. He had corrected her without condescension. He had trusted her without sentimentality. He had left because staying would have made her dependent on a presence she did not need. The pit was hers. The knowledge was hers. What came next was hers alone. What came next was January. The winter started hard and turned harder. The temperature dropped through November and December in stages, each stage colder than the one before. And by the new year the ground was frozen solid to a depth that made Marit worry about the pit. She checked the seal daily. She pressed her palms against the clay and felt for cracks. The cold contracted the surface. She could see hairline fractures in the top layer, and she patched each one with fresh clay mixed from the reserve she kept in the house, warmed by the stove until it was workable. Then the thaw came. Not a gentle thaw, a sudden warming in the 3rd week of January that turned the frozen ground to mud in 3 days. Water pooled in the yard. It ran in sheets across the flat ground where the pit was buried. Marit watched the water cross the seal and felt her stomach drop. White Crane had warned her. Bender had warned her. Water finds the cap. It seeps through. You wake up one morning and your winter supply is soup. She checked the seal. The surface clay was softening under the standing water. She could see the texture changing. The hard, dry surface that had held through 3 months of freeze was becoming pliable again, and pliable meant permeable. She pressed her fingers against it, and they sank in a 1/4 inch before hitting the harder layer beneath. A 1/4 inch was not a breach, but a 1/4 inch today was a 1/2 inch tomorrow and a crack the day after that. She dug a drainage channel, working in mud up to her shins, cutting a shallow trench with a mattock to divert water away from the pit location. The ground fought her, half-frozen clay mixed with standing water, heavy and sucking at every tool stroke. Her boots filled with ice water. Her back seized from the angle of the digging. Anders helped. The boy was stronger now than he had been in the summer. 6 months of hauling and digging and threshing had built muscle onto his small frame that made him look older than 9, and he worked the trench without complaint, throwing mud to the side with a spade that was too big for him and too necessary to set down. The drainage channel diverted the worst of the standing water, but the damage was already started. Marit opened the pit on the 2nd day of the thaw, holding her breath as she broke the seal and found the top sack damp to the touch along the side that faced the repaired south wall. Not wet. not ruined, but damp enough to smell different, a faint mustiness that had not been there before. She pulled the sack, spread the grain on cloth inside the house, and dried it by the stove. She lost a day's worth of bread flour to discoloration, but the rest survived. The lesson was clear. The pit she had built in desperate summer conditions, with a flat-top seal and no drainage, was a first attempt that had saved everything. But the earth was teaching her what White Crane had promised it would. The danger changes. The cold of December was not the same threat as the thaw of January, and a seal designed for one might fail against the other. By the third day of the thaw, other pits were in trouble. Gunderson's pit, dug in sandier soil despite Merritt's warning, had taken water through a crack in the cap. He came to Merritt's fence with mud on his clothes and desperation in his voice. The seal cracked, water got in. The top layer of grain is wet. How wet? Damp, not soaked, but if I do not get it out and dry it, it will mold by the end of the week. Marit went to his pit. She brought Anders because the boy needed to see what failure looked like so he could recognize it before it happened. She examined the crack, a clean split in the clay cap where the freeze-thaw cycle had pulled the seal apart. White Crane's voice in her head. A store is only safe if you think like the danger. The danger changes. The store has to change with it. She showed Gunderson how to pull the wet grain, spread it on cloth inside the house to dry, and then reseal with fresh clay applied in thinner layers that would flex with temperature changes instead of cracking. She showed him how to build a shallow raised lip around the pit mouth, just 2 inches of packed clay, shaped like the rim of a well, that would divert surface water before it reached the seal. She showed him how to test the new seal by pouring a cup of water on it and watching where the water went. If it ran off the lip and into the channel, the seal was sound. If it pooled on the surface, the lip needed to be higher. White Crane did not teach me the lip, she told Gunderson. The lip is mine. The thaw taught me. It was the first time she had added to the method instead of only repeating what she had learned. The first time she had thought like the danger on her own. The realization sat in her chest like a coal, small, warm, and capable of burning for a very long time. She went back and added the lip to her own pit. Then she went to Marta's claim and added it there. Marta's pit had held. She had dug in the dense gray clay where Marit directed and sealed it with the overlapping stroke method, and the thaw ran over it without finding a way in. But Marta stood beside Marit while the lip was built, watching her hands, and said, "You are doing what he did." "What who did?" "White Crane. You are walking claims and fixing what is wrong. You are doing what he did for you." Marit had not thought of it that way. She stood in Marta's yard with clay on her hands and the cold smell of January mud in her nose, and realized that Marta was right. The role had transferred without ceremony. She was the person people came to now, not because she had appointed herself, because she had survived and she had shared what she knew, and in the arithmetic of the frontier, those two things together were worth more than any title or credential a man like Bender could carry. If this story reminds you that the best preparation comes from people willing to learn and teach, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Marta's pit held. She had dug in the dense gray clay where Marit directed and sealed it with the overlapping stroke method, and the thaw ran over it without finding a way in. But Marta came to Marit's fence anyway, and she brought her eldest and her youngest, and she asked Marit to walk her through the lip modification because she did not want to wait for the next thaw to find out whether her seal would crack. The two women worked together for an afternoon, building the raised lip and testing it with poured water, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of a doubter and a believer, but the companionable quiet of two people solving a problem together. 2 more families came that week, a man named Gunder Flatten from 3 miles north who had heard about the pits from Bender. He was a quiet man with large hands and a habit of measuring things with his eyes before he spoke about them. He walked Marit's practice pit, knelt at the mouth, and knocked on the clay walls the way White Crane had knocked, listening for the sound. My grandfather stored root vegetables in a stone-lined cellar in Telemark, he said. The principle is the same. The principle is the same, Marit agreed. The material is different. Stone cracks, clay seals. A young couple named the Espelons, recently married, both under 25, who had lost everything in the swarm and spent the winter on county relief and church charity, came with nothing but questions and the willingness to dig. They stood in Marit's yard and watched her demonstrate on the practice pit. Soil selection, neck width, bell angle, lining, seal, lip, and they wrote nothing down because paper was scarce. But their eyes followed her hands the way her eyes had followed White Crane's. The young wife, Birgit, stayed after her husband left and asked Marit how she had known the pit would work. I did not know, Marit said. I knew the barn would not work. That was enough. Birgit thought about this. We are going to dig one on our new claim. Would you come and look at the soil first? I will come Thursday. It was the first time someone had asked her to consult rather than to give. The distinction was small, but the weight of it was not. Hargrove made his move during the thaw week. He filed a formal claim with the county clerk, arguing that Marit's stored grain constituted the pledged sorghum harvest under a different name. It was a paper argument, thin, technical, designed not to win in court but to exhaust and intimidate. A lone woman with no money for a lawyer and no husband to stand as a legal representative was supposed to fold when the paperwork arrived. The filing itself was an act of malice dressed in legal language. Hargrove knew the grain was wheat, not sorghum. He knew the advance terms specified a specific crop. He knew a destroyed crop voided the collection mechanism. But he also knew that a woman who had to travel 8 miles to the county seat, who had to leave her children and her pits unattended to respond to a claim, who had to spend hours she did not have defending a position she should not have had to defend. That woman might calculate the cost of resistance and decide it was cheaper to settle. He was betting on exhaustion, not the law. Marit did not fold. She showed the claim to Bender, who read it with his lips pressed together, and then said a word she had never heard him say before and would not repeat in front of the children. He rode to the county seat the next day and spoke to the clerk in person. He came back and told Marit that the claim had no merit. The paper specified sorghum, the stored grain was wheat and mixed feed, and the sorghum had been destroyed by an act of nature that voided the advance terms. Hargrove would know this. Hargrove, the ground thawed in stages, froze again, thawed again, and finally gave up resisting. The grass returned in patches. The stripped trees along the draw pushed out new leaves that looked fragile and tentative, as if the trees themselves were not sure the danger had passed. Marit's pit survived the winter intact. The drainage lip she had added during the January thaw held through 2 more melt cycles, channeling water away from the seal and into the trench she and Anders had cut. When she opened the pit for the final time in March, carefully, with the same overlapping technique she had used to seal it, the grain inside was sound. Every sack, every kernel. Cool, dry, and clean, as if the 6 months of freeze and thaw and wind above the ground had been someone else's problem. She kept the seed stock. She planted. By summer of 1875, the settlement looked different. Not rebuilt, that word implies returning to what was. It was rebuilt differently. 7 households now had underground pits, dug into the gray clay bank south of the draw, under Marit's direction. Not all of them were perfect. Gunder Flatten's first attempt was too shallow, and she made him dig it out and start again. The Espeland couple built a beautiful pit with walls so smooth they looked polished, and Birgit Espeland had added her own modification, a second, smaller chamber connected to the first by a narrow passage, meant for seed stock alone, so that the main chamber could be open for bread grain without exposing the future. Marit looked at Birgit's modification and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "That is better than mine." "I learned from yours," Birgit said. "You improved on mine. That is different." It was different. And it was exactly what White Crane had told her would happen. The method would spread, and in spreading, it would change. And in changing, it would become something that belonged not to any one person, but to the settlement itself. The knowledge was leaving her hands and entering other people's, and the versions it became were not copies. They were adaptations. The earth was the same everywhere, but the people reading it were not, and each reading produced something slightly new. Hargrove's second attack came in June. He did not use paper this time. He used reputation. Word began circulating through the settlement that underground grain was contaminated, that the clay leached minerals into the stored food, that children who ate pit-stored grain developed stomach ailments, that a family in a neighboring county had fallen sick from mold that looked like clean grain but carried invisible rot. The source of the rumor was never named directly, but it did not need to be. Every version of the story passed through the mercantile, and every version grew more alarming on the way out. Marit heard the rumor from Marta, who heard it from Mrs. Albrecht, who heard it from a man who had been buying nails at Hargrove's counter. "He says the grain looks sound but tastes wrong," Mrs. Albrecht had reported. "He says a doctor in Dodge City warned against underground storage. He says the clay changes the flour." "Which doctor?" Marit asked. He did not say a name. "Because there is no doctor. There is no family in the next county. There is Silas Hargrove, who is losing customers because people who store their own grain do not need to buy his." The rumor was dangerous, not because it was believable, but because it was unfalsifiable. How do you prove grain is not contaminated? How do you prove an invisible poison does not exist? The doubt was enough. 2 families who had been planning to dig pits that summer delayed. A man, Lena, 6 and free of the cough that had terrified Marit during the swarm, chewed her bread and looked at the visitors with the frank curiosity of a child who did not understand why grown people needed to watch other people eat before they would believe the food was safe. The doubters ate the bread. It tasted like bread. The 2 families who had delayed went home and started digging the next week. Hargrove heard about the demonstration. He did not come to the claim. He did not send another proxy. He was quiet for a long time after that, and the quiet was worse in some ways than the attacks, because a quiet Hargrove was a Hargrove who was calculating, and Marit had learned that his calculations were always about leverage. The resolution came not from Marit, but from the weather. The winter of 1875 to 76 was harder than the one before. The temperature dropped earlier. The snow came heavier. Families that had stored grain in pits rode through it with discomfort, but not desperation. Families that had rebuilt their barns and trusted boards again found themselves in the same position they had been in after the swarm, watching stored food degrade, watching mice find the seams, watching the slow arithmetic of spoilage subtract from a supply that was already short. Hargrove's own store was not immune. He had always kept his trading stock in a framed warehouse behind the mercantile, a proper building, planked and roofed and nailed shut, the kind of structure Bender would have called adequate. The mice found it in November. A wet spell in December softened the floor joists and mold crept up through the boards. By January, Hargrove was facing the same problem every other above-ground store in the county was facing, except that his problem was also his livelihood. If his trading stock spoiled, he had nothing to sell and nothing to lend, and no mechanism for the dependency that kept his business running. He came to Marit's claim on a morning in late January. He stood at the fence and did not cross it. He looked like he had not slept. His clean hands, the hands that had always been his distinction, the hands that marked him as a man who did not dig, were chapped and red, which meant he had been working with his own stock, trying to salvage what the damp was taking. "Mrs. Tveit," he said. "Mr. Hargrove." A long silence. The kind of silence that has a negotiation inside it, not over price, but over pride. Hargrove's eyes moved from the ground to the barn to the sky and back to the ground, as if he were looking for somewhere to put what he was about to say that would make it cost less. "I need to understand your method," he said. The words came out like stones being pushed uphill, each one heavier than the last, each one resisting the direction it was being moved. "I have stock that will not survive February in the warehouse. The floor joists are soft. The mice found the back wall. I need to move it underground before it is lost." Marit looked at him. She looked at the man who had stood at this same fence 2 summers ago and called her a badger, the man who had threatened her with a ledger and a level voice, the man who had filed a fraudulent claim to frighten her into settling, the man who had seeded a rumor about contaminated grain to keep his neighbors dependent on his store. He stood at her fence with chapped hands and sleepless eyes and the rigid posture of a man who was holding himself upright by will alone, because if he let his shoulders drop, the defeat would be visible. She could have refused. She had earned the right to refuse. Every insult, every manipulation, every small cruelty he had aimed at her and her children was reason enough to let him stand at that fence until his stock rotted and his business collapsed, and he learned what it felt like to watch something you had built fail because the method you trusted was the wrong one. The thought sat in her chest, and it was warm, and it was satisfying, and it lasted about 3 seconds. She thought about White Crane, about a man who had walked onto her claim without being asked and had looked at her bleeding hands and her narrow-mouthed pit and had said, "You chose the right clay." He had not asked whether she deserved help. He had not weighed her character against her need. He had seen competence that needed correction, and he had corrected it. He had seen need and met it, not because she had earned it, because the knowledge was not a weapon. It was a tool, and tools that are hoarded rust. "Come inside the fence," Marit said. She walked him to the practice pit. She showed him the clay selection, the gray, not the brown, and how to tell them apart by touch and by the sound they made when struck. She showed him the neck width and explained why narrower was better, less exposed surface, easier to seal, harder for anything to enter. She showed him the bell angle and the principle behind it, minimum contact between stored material and surrounding earth. She showed him the lining and how to prepare it. She showed him the seal, the overlapping strokes, the pressure from both palms, the way the clay had to be wet enough to bond but dry enough to hold shape. She showed him the drainage lip and explained that it was her own addition, developed after White Crane left because the danger changes and the store has to change with it. Hargrove listened. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He did not make the small dismissive sound she had heard from him at the fence a year ago. He asked 2 questions, one about depth in relation to the water table, one about how often the seal needed inspection, and both questions were practical. When she was finished, he stood at the edge of the practice pit and looked down into it for a long time. His face was doing something she had never seen it do before. It was rearranging itself around an admission that his mouth had not yet made. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Several, in fact. The claim I filed was baseless. I knew it was baseless when I filed it. The talk about contamination that came from my counter. I did not say the words, but I did not correct them when they were said in my hearing, and that amounts to the same thing." Marit waited. She had learned waiting from White Crane, and from the clay, and from the pit itself, the long, still patience of things that hold their shape while the world above them shifts. "You owe me nothing," she said, "but you owe your neighbors honesty. If you're going to use this method, you will need to tell people that you were wrong about it. Not that you changed your mind, that you were wrong." Hargrove's jaw tightened. The apology was one thing, private, contained, spoken at a fence where only Marit and the wind could hear it. Public correction was another act entirely. But he looked at his chapped hands, and he looked at the pit, and he did the arithmetic that he had always been good at, and the numbers came out the same way they always did. Survival first, pride second. That was the one calculation Hargrove and Merritt had always agreed on, even when they agreed on nothing else. "I will tell them," he said. He did. Not gracefully, not with the warmth of a convert who has seen the light. He told people at the mercantile counter in his flat, level voice that he had been mistaken about underground storage and that Mrs. Tavate's method was sound. He said it the way he said everything, as if issuing a ruling rather than admitting a fault, and the settlement received it with the quiet satisfaction of people who had already known the truth and were merely waiting for the last holdout to catch up. Johann Nessheim arrived in the county that spring. He was Bender's nephew, a widower of 36 who had lost his wife to typhoid on a claim near Salina and had come west looking for land that did not carry her memory in every fence post and furrow. He was tall and quiet and had the build of a man who had been doing physical work since before his body was finished growing. His hands were scarred across the knuckles from a decade of splitting rails and setting posts. Bender brought him to Marit's claim because Bender had decided, with the blunt certainty of an old man who has stopped asking permission to arrange other people's lives, that his nephew needed to see how the pits worked. Marit showed Johann the practice pit. He knelt at the mouth, ran his hand along the bell wall, and knocked the clay with his knuckle. The sound was the same dense thud that White Crane had listened for. "The chamber angle is steeper than I expected," Johann said. "Less surface contact with the earth." Marit looked at him. Most visitors noticed the depth, the width, the seal. This was the first person besides White Crane and Birgit Espeland who had noticed the angle. "Less surface means less moisture migration," she said. "I know." He stood. "I built ice cellars in Saline County. Different purpose, same principle. You want the minimum contact between what you are storing and the medium you're storing it in." She did not answer immediately. She was recalculating something, not the pit, but the man standing at its edge. He had looked at the work and seen not just what it did, but why it was shaped the way it was shaped. That was rare. That was what White Crane had done the first time he stood at the pit mouth and said, "You chose the right clay." "If you are taking a claim nearby," Marit said, "I can show you where the gray clay runs deepest." "I would appreciate that," Johann said. "He took a claim 2 miles north. He dug his own pit in 3 days fast because he understood the principles and because his body was built for the work in a way Marit's was not. He made one modification she had not thought of, a shallow shelf cut into the bell wall at shoulder height, just wide enough to hold a sealed crock. "For the things you need first," he said, "yeast, salt, rendered fat, so you do not have to dig to the bottom every time you open the pit." Marit looked at the shelf. "That is better than mine," she said, and the echo of what she had said to Birgit Espeland was deliberate. The method was growing. It was growing because she let it grow, and because the people who learned it were not copies of her, but versions of themselves. The courtship was slow and had nothing to do with sentiment. It had to do with work, which on the frontier was the same thing as character made visible. Johann repaired Marit's barn roof properly this time, with seasoned lumber he traded for from a sawmill near Dodge City. The work took 3 days, and during those 3 days he did not once suggest that the roof should have been built differently in the first place. He fixed what was broken. He did not assign blame to the man who had built it poorly and then left. Marit noticed this. She noticed the way he handled tools, not roughly, not gently, but with the specific pressure each task required. She noticed the way he spoke to Anders directly about the work, with the assumption that the boy knew what he was doing. He asked Anders to show him the pit, not Marit. Anders, and the boy led him down into the bell chamber and pointed out the repaired south wall and the straw lining and the drainage lip. And Johan listened and asked a question about the seal that Anders answered correctly, and the boy's face changed in a way Marit had not seen since before Peter left, the face of someone whose knowledge has been taken seriously by a person who matters. She showed Johan how to prepare straw lining so it would not compress under the weight of filled sacks. He brought tools. She brought knowledge. He mended the hog pen gate. She walked his claim and marked where the gray clay ran deepest. The exchanges were practical, measurable, and continuous, and the accumulation of them, the mornings he appeared at the fence with a repaired axe handle, the afternoons she spent at his claim testing soil for the pit he was building, created a partnership the way the earth creates a formation. Slowly, through pressure, without announcement. One evening in late summer, they sat on the step after the children had gone inside. The sky was the color it turns just before it gives up on being blue and becomes something darker and more permanent. Johan was repairing a leather hinge. Marit was grinding grain for the morning's bread. They worked in the quiet that had become their natural state, the quiet of two people who did not need to fill silence with speech because the silence itself was comfortable. "I had a wife," Johan said. He did not look up from the hinge. "She died of typhoid on our claim near Salina. I buried her under the elm tree she planted the first spring. I left because the tree was still there and she was not, and I could not look at one without thinking of the other." Marit said nothing. She ground the grain. The sound of stone on grain was the sound of the frontier itself, repetitive, necessary, and old. "I am not looking for someone to replace her," Johan said. "I am looking for someone to work beside. If that is something you would consider, I would like to stay." "Stay," Marit said. And that was the whole of it, the courtship, the proposal, and the answer, delivered over a leather hinge in a hand mill on a step in Hodgman County, while the sky turned dark and the pits beneath the yard held the winter's food in silence. They married in the autumn of 1876. The ceremony was at the county seat, a brief exchange of words in a clerk's office that smelled of paper dust and lamp oil. Bender stood as witness, upright and formal, in a coat he had not worn since his second wife's funeral. Marta brought bread baked from pit-stored grain, wrapped in cloth that still smelled faintly of the kitchen where she had kneaded it at dawn. Anders wore a shirt that was too small for him because he had grown 3 inches since the swarm, and Lena carried a fistful of late wildflowers that she dropped twice on the way to the clerk's office and picked up both times without being asked. The years compressed after that, the way years do when the ticking clock stops and the work becomes the rhythm instead of the race. Johan and Marit expanded the claim. They built a proper house, framed, roofed, with glass windows that Johan hauled from Dodge City on a wagon he built himself. They tore down the old soddy and used the timbers for fence posts. The barn was rebuilt with seasoned lumber and sealed joints, but they never used it for primary grain storage. The pits remained. 3 of them now on the Tivite Nesheim claim alone, 1 for bread grain, 1 for seed stock, 1 for feed, each with drainage lips and Birgit's separated chambers and Johann's shelf system. The best of every version gathered back into the original. A daughter was born in 1878. They named her Ragna after Marit's mother. A son followed in 1880, Torsten, who had his father's build and his mother's habit of pressing his palm against the ground when he was thinking. The children grew up knowing the pits the way other children knew their barns, as a fact of the landscape, unremarkable and permanent. By the time Ragna was old enough to carry grain, she could read clay by touch and tell good lining straw from bad by the sound it made when bundled. The knowledge was passing forward again, not through crisis, but through daily life, the way language passes, not taught, but absorbed. More families dug pits. A county agricultural note in 1880 mentioned earth granaries on claims in the western reaches, narrow-mouthed, clay-sealed, lined with grass. The note did not name Marit. It did not need to. The method had left her hands and entered the land itself, the way seeds enter soil and become something that no longer remembers the hand that planted them. Word came north once, through a traveler who had passed through the Solomon River settlements, that an old man named White Crane had died during the winter of 1879. The traveler did not know the details. He said the man was remembered by his sister's family as someone who understood the earth better than the people who claimed to own it. Marit received the news standing in the yard, beside the pit that White Crane had helped her build, and she did not speak for a long time afterward. When she did speak, it was to Anders, who was 16 by then, and had already supervised the digging of 2 pits on neighboring claims without his mother's help. She said, "He told me the earth does not forget how to keep things. He was right about that." She did not say the rest of what she was thinking, which was that the earth does not forget how to keep people either. White Crane was in the clay she had learned to read. He was in the seal she pressed with both palms. He was in the sound her knuckles made when she knocked on a wall to test its density. He was in the space between what she knew before he arrived and what she knew after he left, and that space was the shape of everything she had become. Bender died in 1881. He was 65, and his heart stopped on a Tuesday morning while he was saddling the dun mare. Marit stood at his grave and thought about the first time he had ridden onto her claim and told her the arithmetic did not work. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong, and he had admitted it, and he had spent the last 7 years of his life sending people to her fence to learn the thing he had once told her was impossible. That was its own kind of legacy, the legacy of a man who could change his mind when the evidence required it, and who wore the change openly rather than pretending he had known all along. Marta Schilling became Marit's closest collaborator in the years that followed. Together they walked claims, tested soil, supervised digs, and taught the method to families who arrived in the county knowing nothing about underground storage and everything about the fear of losing what they had. Carl, the boy who had collapsed from hunger after the swarm, grew into a young man who dug pits faster than anyone in the county and who told new settlers without embarrassment that the reason he was alive was because a woman he called Aunt Marit had opened a hole in the ground and pulled out bread when there was none left above it. Marit aged the way the plains aged her, slowly, thoroughly, without apology. Her hands, which had bled on the mattock handle in the summer of '74, became thick and hard and sure. She spent less time in the pits as the years passed, and more time at their edges, showing where to place the first spade, where the gray clay ran, where the seam changed. She became the woman other women brought their questions to, not just about storage, but about soil and weather and the calculus of what to save and what to spend. Even in good years, she kept a hidden reserve no one discussed, a small pit separate from the household stores, sealed and unmarked, containing enough seed grain for one season's planting. She checked it every autumn and every spring. She never told anyone where it was. White Crane had taught her that a thing that cannot be seen cannot be taken. She carried that lesson forward the way she carried the memory of an older woman kneeling at a pit mouth on the upper Missouri, pressing clay with both palms, not as a technique, but as a way of thinking about what the world could take from you and what, if you were careful and stubborn and willing to go deeper than the danger, it could not. Within a decade of the swarm, more than 20 families in and around Hodgman County had adopted some form of sealed underground storage for reserve grain and seed. A traveler passing through in 1883 wrote in a letter home about the Kansas women who bury their harvests like treasure and pull them up clean in the spring. The method was never patented. It was never published in a manual. Traveled the way useful things travel on the frontier, from one fence to the next, carried by women with clay on their hands and grain in their aprons, modified by every pair of hands that touched it. Marit lived on the plains until her death in 1912, at the age of 70. She was buried on the claim she had held since 1872, the quarter section she could not leave and would not leave and finally chose not to leave. In her last years, she walked the property slowly, stopping at the places where the original pits had been, pressing her palm against the ground the way she had pressed it against the clay bank on the day the idea came. Her granddaughter Ragna's eldest asked her once what she was listening for. She said, "The cold. If the cold is still there, the earth is still holding." The summer of 1874, the sky over Hodgeman County turned brown with wings, and the sound of a million mandibles filled the air until it left no room for anything else. Silas Hargrove leaned on a fence post and told a woman with bleeding hands and two hungry children that she was burying food like a badger because she could not build a proper granary. The field